Yeah, so I choreographed a piece called Polarity, and I decided I wanted to do something that wasn't so much on creating a piece for myself, but also to create a piece to work with the younger dancers to help them improve in a more contemporary way, as a lot of the dancers in WO Ballet are very classical. It's very hard for some of the younger ones that have come from a very classical background to have these experiences of working in more of a contemporary way.
Mhm.
And I always felt like that was a really hard thing to learn when you're in a company. So I wanted to give some of them a chance to do something. And at the same time, I wanted to have some artistic freedom and create something. So I chose two young dancers, Keigo and Mayumi, to work with. They did an incredible job. It was very, very tough for them uh, to sort of break break out of that classical structure.
Yeah.
But they did very well in the end, and I was really proud of them. Yeah, if we go back to me deciding whether to choreograph a piece or not initially, this is not the first piece I've choreographed. The first piece I choreographed was back in Europe when I danced with the Leipzig Ballet. And I wait for a piece of music to speak to me, which then gives me some ideas to start my artistic influence to start creating. And I was struggling to find a piece. I was listening to a lot of music and sort of waiting for this spark to happen when I find a piece. And it was quite close to the cutoff point, and I found this piece of music and was very excited about some emotions in my life that were happening at that time, that I could see them being somehow um, danced out, like expressed in that way. And then I came up with this idea of creating movements that were very simple. And then I wanted to create the same movement, but at like another extreme. So it's the same, but different. As I looked into the music, actually, funnily enough, the music was called Polarity. The sort of meaning of polarity is in the dictionary, it's a state of having two opposite or contradictory tendencies, opinions, or aspects. And this made me think a lot about already the path that I was going down, but then even going deeper into it. So really having at one end one dancer moving and then doing sort of the same movement, but the opposite or the other end of the polarity. And that sort of started creating the ideas and movements. And definitely my years in Europe and all the different choreographers that I've worked with over my years have been a massive influence in this piece. I wouldn't say I'm the most original choreographer. It's
Mhm.
more me getting ideas from things that I've done and mishmashing them together in my own way and adding my own emotional intent on top of that. I don't think it's always necessary to be 100% original, as people are always going to find some way to say that it's not original. No matter what you do, even if you choreograph something you didn't see it anywhere, you'd never seen it anywhere, it's original to you, someone will turn around and be like, oh, that was done with that person. So to work like that, I find is just a barrier. So why not just, how you say, embrace it?
Mhm.
So I've taken sort of parts of my career and thought, oh, why don't I think like this choreographer that I worked with for this part? And that gave me some ideas of keeping my old director, Mario Schroeder, used a lot of parallel lines. So a lot of like arms very parallel. So I have a lot of those lines in there. There was moments that I thought of him. And then there are other moments where I thought of a choreographer back in Croatia called Leo Mujic, who taught me a lot as well about moving big and using space. And you just sort of go through these choreographers. The final influence, I think, for me was also leaving Europe, and I left someone that I loved very dear in Europe, and that was a massive influence on the piece as well. I wasn't sure exactly where it was going to go initially, especially since the music is very repetitive and it builds, and I needed the choreography to constantly move forward. There's one major break, which I had of the girls solo, but besides that, it just keeps pushing. And I had to just keep pushing the choreography and just keep layering more and more and more and trying to add meaning. And I then got to a point where I actually thought that I was going to have to shorten music because I just pushed the dancers so hard. I noticed that they were struggling to get to the end. Mm-hmm. And we worked it a couple of times for quite a few weeks trying to figure out if it was worth shortening. And then in the end, I actually slowed it right down. Mm-hmm. And I had this idea of this emotional aspect of the two people coming together at the end, and slowed it right down at the end. And I initially really wanted the male dancer to just have this image and thought of the dancer being lit from behind and just seeing the silhouette of the dancer. And then I actually talked quite early on with the lighting designer, and he had an idea of lighting the male at the back with a silhouette. And because it's so strong, you see his silhouette, but then that light would actually flood all the way down to the front of the stage, mm-hmm. where Mayumi would be, and you would actually see the whole of her. So there wouldn't actually be a shadow on her because the light would flood through. Mm-hmm. And this definitely gave it a beautiful contrast from the two ends, and also gave this nice diagonal of light of sort of, hey, they're the two ends of the polarity. And then as I went on and, researched more into the name of the piece and the meaning of polarity, that gave me this idea of this diagonal of light and using both ends. And then as the piece went on, I somehow got more emotionally involved in the piece, and I started to think about myself being with someone who I've been with, and in the end, us both having to go separate paths for our own separate reasons. And that's sort of where and why the ending is what it is. Yeah, well, definitely for this piece, I really used a lot of the diagonal line, and certain parts of the body taking you in certain directions. Mm-hmm. So there would be a hand leading you forward, or the chest leading you back, and the pulling of the bodies in at both ends of the polarity. And this also led to a lot of angular movements, and also, a lot of somehow rigid lines that were then cut and broken and moved. And then there are also some points there's a point closer to the end where I sort of tried to break it a little bit and separate from that diagonal at one point, where they sort of go away from it and come back. And I had an idea to have this point where they're not being pulled at this point, but they're actually just dancing together, and they're with each other's polarity, but then it comes back to this diagonal and them going their separate ways again. It's not something that I would say that I'm thinking of as I'm constructing a piece. There are definitely moments where, actually there's a point quite close to the beginning of the piece where the dancers come together for one of the first times. And I'd created 2 little solos, and initially I actually had them further away. And then I realized that the 2 little solos had these beautiful levels. So I actually adjusted the solos to have these levels where one's up and one's down, or one's out and one's in. And we played around with that section quite a bit. And it's ended up being my favorite part of the piece. So it's not like a part like that just comes from, choreographing it straightforward. Mm-hmm. Some of these nicer moments, you have to take a different path of creating one bit, create another bit, see what goes together. Yeah, I've choreographed before, and it was a very different process. We actually had to do a lot more in our free time. So this was actually quite enlightening to have time to work with the dancers, and there wasn't actually anywhere near as much pressure as I've had in the past. I had time to think and time to process and decide what I wanted to do next. For me, the process often is coming into the studio and putting on initially just music, often more ambient music, and just playing around with movement, around with ideas of how I'm feeling and what I would like to show. And then I'd put on the music that I want to use, and then I would try and take some of those ideas and see how they would connect with the music. And then I would get the dancers in the studio and I would teach that part to them. And often it would only be a short part, and we end up creating from that quite a bit more. We create together a lot, either adapt it to them, or we realize that some things work, some things don't. There was one point we had this idea for an amazing lift that I especially liked, and we tried it, and the lift was great. We must have spent maybe half an hour on this lift, but then getting into it at the part of the piece where they were tired was just not going to be possible at that point. So we did spend sometimes quite a bit of time on things that just didn't work out, and we just had to scrap the ideas, and we thought, oh, maybe we'll bring that back later. And sometimes we did bring things back, and sometimes we just scrapped them, and maybe I'll use them again in the future. Yeah, definitely supported by the dancers. Yeah. There was one point towards the end where I think they started to feel like it was a lot of material. When you more go on a classical choreography, sort of a couple of steps can take up quite a large chunk of music. Yet with a more contemporary piece, you can have a step on each count, or even steps in between each count. So you can spend a long time creating a section that is only like 20 seconds, maybe even less. And I think this was sometimes hard for them to get their head around. And then as we added more, it was more about literally just them getting the coordination to do it. It wasn't actually that hard sometimes, but they had to repeat to make sure the coordination was there. I think living in Leipzig, which is just outside of Berlin, and spending a lot of time in Berlin definitely had a huge influence on the basicness of the costumes, and this I really wanted this natural lighting and natural costume. So we had the girl, I wanted her to be somewhat sexy, and I liked the idea of a sleeved leotard. And then I wanted to see as much the body texture in the man as possible, to see those lines, especially in the beginning when you see that shadow. I didn't want any fabric hanging, or too much fabric hanging, that was going to disturb that beautiful silhouette. And then I wanted to think how I could connect the two costumes together. And I just had this idea of literally just getting a similar fabric to the netting that was in the girls, and just having a small, somewhat half skirt on the guy. But I also didn't want it too long. I didn't, as I said, didn't want to ruin the silhouette of the image and take away from seeing the body. Yeah, well, I definitely had this idea of the beginning, the male being in silhouette. And then we had this idea of, when I talked to lighting designer, to have the silhouette then would flood to the female dancer, Mayumi, down the front of the stage. So she wouldn't be in silhouette, but she would just be lit, but actually lit from the light that's behind the male, which worked really well. But it was very, very hard for Keigo to dance with that light, because it was very strong and he struggled a lot, but he did an amazing job in the end. From there, I also wanted, initially my idea, my image was to have a single beam of light in the center of the stage, in the center of the diagonal, and sort of having this single beam of light representing the togetherness of the two couples. Unfortunately, we didn't have a light that could be put directly in the center. So we went for two beams of light coming down, and initially they were crossed. I think. Yeah, well, they were actually together, coming down to one point. So we had somewhat representing the two of them together. And initially we had those lights randomly coming on and off to sort of somehow symbolize the uncertainty of the two and then coming together. And then I also had we added a little bit of lighting around the space at some point to pull them away a little bit from this pure diagonal. And then we wanted to do a bit more at the end with these two lights, and then we actually had them cross at one point, which somehow felt to me represented them getting closer together. And then we sort of faded those out and the whole thing out as they left the stage. I think if I had the chance to do it on a bigger stage and actually get this single beam of light in the center, I would really like to see how that would work, because somehow the lighting that was coming from the top came down and actually missed their bodies and touched the floor. But when they were in the center, it only sort of covered their feet. And I based a lot of the choreography on that center point when they're together. So if I had that opportunity to do the piece with that lighting, I would love to see how that light would hit them and the emotions it would have of that light beaming down on that center. I mean, I'm very happy that we're doing this, and also they're giving us the time in WA Ballet to really take it as a real choreographer would take it. Mm-hmm. Not sort of, it's like a side project that if you want to do it, you can do it. That's sort of, yeah, like you find time yourself to do it. But it was really like, it was an official thing. We really had time. There was rehearsal time, and I very much enjoyed that. It was a discovery process for myself too. And it was a good way for me to go through a lot of the emotions that I've gone through over the past couple of months.